Yesterday I saw an Amazon van in my neighborhood with the slogan, "Warning, contents may contain happiness," slapped on the side in large white font. A man then parked the car and jumped out of it from the driver's seat and grabbed packages from the back and threw them on my neighbor's porch. For my neighbor to come out and grab them looking like a gremlin in sloppy work at home attire. To then crawl back into his den, slamming the door and locking it. I thought, humans were never meant to have this level of convenience. I mean, you literally have love and food at your fingertips. The sheer escapism that we have is amazing. You can literally never leave your house and somehow be able to live comfortably. Though this simplification ironically devoids us of many of our needs. People have the least amount of friends and the least opportunities to socialize ever before. What is funny about this is that this epidemic affects every single demographic in America. So is it our fault why community is this way, or is this something that is out of our control? There was this poll that I saw recently that was not surprising at all by Gallup, and that was how many friendships Gen Z had in comparison to Gen X, the years 1990 in comparison to the year 2021. And just looking at the data, Gen Z has way less friends than Gen X did. 15% of Gen Z men have 0 friends. 10% of Gen Z women have 0 friends. Gen X, they had multiple friends. They had, on average, more than 5 friends. And I asked my parents about this statistic, and they were like, yeah, it was so easy to meet people back then. People just went out and did things. They went to the mall. They would actually meet people through their friends at the mall, and they would just hang out, go to the food court, shop, play at the arcade. They would drive around aimlessly for hours around the city, just doing like nothing, and then stopping off in a parking lot to like hacky sack and just mess around. It just goes to show how different lives Gen Z adolescents have lived in comparison to Gen X adolescents. And in a way, it kind of makes me jealous because I'm 23 and I never got to experience that immense amount of community my parents did throughout their childhood. I was inside all the time. I barely played with any of the neighbor kids, and every single city I lived in, it was just more of the same. I think that feeling might be a result to moving around a lot as a kid, but even in that, I spent a lot of my elementary years and middle school years in Independence, the same place my parents grew up in, but by the time I lived there, it was a remnant of the past. And when I moved away, it became a concrete graveyard, similar to a ghost town. Maybe in some ways it was destined to become this because the city itself started off as a trading post as Americans were settling westward. It was not a place people wanted to live in. And its prosperity of commerce was short-lived as it was outcompeted by another post by the name of Westport. Westport was just better geographically located on the trail route, and it was also in close proximity to the Missouri River, in which the charlatans that ran the city optimized the use of the steamboat to trade goods. Independence was left in the dust and even lost population during this time as Westport grew into what we now know as Kansas City. Though thought as a dead town by most, would see revitalization as post-war America was in a craze to live in the suburbs. Independence grew immensely over the 50s and 60s as most of its land was subsidized by the city, and the passing of the 1951 Kansas City Highway Plan connected many of the outward townships to the central and southern parts of the city. Workers that had jobs downtown could now live further away as commuting times cut immensely. This mixed with the fact that all American suburbs promised people with 2 main things: land and a sense of community. I think Independence kept its promise on these things too in the early days, with its infrastructure being more community driven. If it's the Chrysler Stadium where little boys and fathers would go and play Little League, or the fact that its main roads connected between 2 separate large malls, the Independence Center and the Blue Ridge Mall, where kids would go and hang out with their friends. Nolan Road / US 40 was huge for the community as it was the road that connected 2 separate parts of town. On these roads, you would find many food restaurants and shops, but as well connected Blue Ridge Mall to the Independence Center. And this sequence is not only important economically, but also the roads would serve the purpose of being driven by many young people on a Friday night trying to get some poon. This would be the case for my parents' generation, which met up with friends and met friends on these nights out, with this phenomenon literally being called cruising. Cruising, if you aren't aware of, was an activity that was prevalent in American culture post-World War II, where people drove around cities showing off their cars, racing, and just generally hanging out with their friends. Boys were kind of the main demographic of this, trying to use cruising as a way to garner the attention of women who would tag along on these nights out. Most of the location of these cruising spots is interesting in itself too, as most of them were in the suburbs where most people lived and also where most people complained. The rowdy, noisy behavior of young people on these nights out would irritate adults to the point where ordinances would be passed. And for the case of Independence, laws were put in for curfew on minors, and noise complaint legislation would eventually go and damper the socialization of the youth and this phenomenon. Cruising culture was bound to die because of these legislations, and it did in the early 2000s, but the youth in Independence did have one thing, and that was the access to malls in which people still hung out at. But those were even declining at a rapid pace with the rise of the strip mall. Creation of these shopping areas was the main thing that killed one of the main malls in the area called Blue Ridge, which was demolished in 2005. Though the mall had been having trouble beforehand as many major box stores left for Oak Park or just went to singular buildings, this exact situation is playing out with the Center, which is the last remaining mall in Independence, with all the major shops leaving and the shopping center almost going bankrupt. Surprisingly, it hasn't. With a change of ownership, it has stayed open, but also has somehow got worse. The carousel in the play area has closed down, and the crime has been terrible. Since there is so much emptiness in the mall, people can get away with doing pretty much anything, and most of the time, these criminals don't even get caught. How many times has a shooting occurred in recent years where ordinary shoppers have been killed or injured? It's sad to see how the connectivity of the mall has declined to being something not even safe to really go to. Though it shouldn't be a testament just to the death of youth culture, but the death of malls and the rise of meth in the community that made it unsafe for children to be children. I can literally attest to this with living across the street to a house that held a small business that people loved to go to at nighttime. I was never allowed to just hang out because most of the people in my neighborhood were selling or on drugs. The pipeline of meth getting into the community started when biker gangs from California needed a place to traffic and cook up in a more discreet location since they were being investigated heavily on the West Coast by law enforcement. The Midwest was perfect for its discreetness, and with that, many of the labs were created in rural America, but as well as bigger cities like Kansas City, which would be a hub for its centralized location in the middle of the country. Jackson County was hit pretty hard as a whole, and they banned a lot of illicit substances that made many of the drugs. Though these days, people aren't really making meth in Independence. They are more importing from places like Mexico, where meth is made cheaply, as well as opioids being the new drug of choice in recent years. Many of the issues I describe about Independence is not exclusive. If you're from Cleveland, St. Louis, Detroit, you'll know the cold feeling of vacancy and the issues of drugs in your community. It feels sometimes that there are cities across America in which no one cares about since they don't provide significant industry or cultural importance to the country. I mean, how many times have we seen people complain and make the problems of San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Austin visible, but neglect the Midwest? And to think that only caring about certain parts of the country while others rot is not necessarily beneficial to our country. The people ignored tend to feel isolated and end up going to extremes to be heard. Of course, there are other things that have made us isolated, like phones and working from home, but maybe if we incorporated positive social outlets in our communities, we could have a solution.